Welcome, folks, to this edition of the 700 Club. Only in Washington could $5.4 trillion be called an austerity budget. $5.4 trillion. But the president says in another 15 or 20 years, he'll cut 5% a year off of non-defense spending, and the budget will be balanced by the time that I'm dead and the rest of us are in the old folks' home.
Is that reassuring, huh?
It's very reassuring. But anyhow, the president also is asking for more money for the border wall. That's going to be a problem. And Nancy Pelosi has come up with what seems to be reasonable. There is no way under heaven that the Democrats can impeach President Trump. They can bring an impeachment motion in the House, and what does it do? It will occupy all of their time. It'll take all the oxygen out of their program, and when it hits the Senate, it will fail. So you remember what happened with Bill Clinton? They passed an impeachment resolution in the House, and it was voted down in the Senate. And so what did the Democrats do? They've lost the momentum. And Nancy Pelosi is a pretty canny lady. She says, well, he's not worth impeaching. Well, yeah, he is worth impeaching, but they can't do it. That's what it amounts to. So the other problem that's going to come up is they're asking for an increase in the debt ceiling, and if they don't get it, they won't be able to borrow money, and if they can't borrow money, then they can't pay their bills, and so forth and so on. So that's coming up, and I hope we don't have a budget battle. And the last thing anybody wants is to see this government shut down. Well, Terry, it's going to be interesting. And by the way, the Russian president is assassinated by his son-in-law. The son-in-law becomes an agent of the government. Our SEAL team goes to North Korea to get a defector. It's an exciting thing. They are looking for a nuclear bomb. And the head of Iran wants to blow the world up. I mean, that's all in Joel Rosenberg.
I was going to say, sounds like Joel Rosenberg.
Joel's here to tell us it's an exciting book, and you don't want to miss anything about this very exciting author. Okay, Terry.
As Pat mentioned, the president's latest budget proposal calls for 5% spending across the board. It also increases defense spending. Gary Lane has details.
The president's new proposed budget includes a record $4.7 trillion in federal spending and 5% across-the-board cuts to most non-defense discretionary programs. Acting Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Russ Vought, says cuts are needed to balance the budget in 15 years.
Washington has a spending problem.
Trump's budget increases defense spending, jumping to $750 billion, but it reduces domestic spending by $30 billion. One of the hardest hit agencies, environmental protection. Trump wants to cut that 31%. The State Department would see a 23% budget reduction. Housing and urban development would be reduced by 16.4%, and education 12%. Democratic leaders Pelosi and Schumer have already rejected the president's proposal, and self-proclaimed socialist Bernie Sanders said it is filled with cruelty. Sanders said Trump's budget is, quote, a budget for the military-industrial complex, for corporate CEOs, for Wall Street, and for the billionaire class. Vought says it breaks with congressional practices of the past.
They continue to let a paradigm exist in this country that says for every dollar in defense spending, we're going to increase non-defense spending by $1. We think we need to break that paradigm. We don't think that that paradigm allows us to be able to get our fiscal house in order.
The national debt currently stands at $22 trillion. In 2016, candidate Trump promised to eliminate the national debt in 8 years. So what happened to Trump's promise?
Congress has been ignoring the president's spending reductions for the last 2 years. It's only now in our third budget that they're willing to have a conversation about the national debt. We've been trying to have it since we got to office.
Funding for a border wall is back in the debate. The president told Breitbart News he's concerned about adding more immigrants to the welfare rolls. He's asking Congress for $8.6 billion to construct an additional 700 miles of fencing along the Mexican border. And once again, border wall funding could lead to another government shutdown. Not immediately, but before the next federal fiscal year begins October 1st. Gary Lane, CBN News.
Thanks, Gary. Ladies and gentlemen, the elephant in the room is what's called entitlements. They continue to grow, and nobody's really addressing it. We've got Medicare, Medicaid, all those entitlements. We've got Social Security, and we've got all these pensions for the elderly. And like it or not, there's got to be some addressing of that situation, especially as the population is growing older and 80s become the new 70 and so forth. I just believe it's crucial that the age of retirement benefit introduction must be raised. There's just got to be. It may not be popular politically, but they're going to have to do it. They can do it a little bit at a time, gradually, but it has to be done because this is an area that is going to eat up everything else. And before it's finished, if you have a $22 trillion and a 23 and a 4 and ultimately a $40 trillion deficit, the interest on the debt will consume everything else in the budget. There won't be room for anything else. And that's something that we've got to deal with. We have to begin to lower the budget, and the people in Washington just don't seem to want to do that. Well, in other news, the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, says, I don't want to impeach the president. Well, she's a pretty canny pal, and she knows good and well she couldn't get it done if she wanted to. John Jessup has more.
Pat, the speaker says it's just not worth it to impeach the president, telling the Washington Post, quote, unless there's something so compelling and overwhelming and bipartisan, I don't think we should go down that path because it divides the country. She also said the president is not ethically, intellectually, or politically fit to run the country. Pelosi's anti-impeachment stance won't sit well with some in her party. Last week, House committees led by Democrats launched a series of investigations into the president. Still, Democrats on the campaign trail say it's time for President Trump to go. But they'll do it the old-fashioned way at the ballot box. And if they have any success, polls show they'll get a lot of help from millennial voters. As Jenna Browder reports, this group of young voters is solidly in the Democratic camp.
In 2020, millennials will be the largest voting bloc, surpassing baby boomers, and it could spell real trouble for the GOP.
There's a number of things happening at once.
Republican strategist John Brabender sees a potential perfect storm. First, millennials aged 20 to 34 are bigger in number and more engaged than ever.
It used to be younger voters were somewhat apathetic and they would increase their participation as they got older, but we found in the midterms that in a lot of the states, in fact, the most targeted states, saw this big increase as much as 10% by millennial voters.
They also overwhelmingly voted for Democrats in 2016.
And then number three is how they get their news has changed dramatically. They're leading sort of the cord-cutting revolution. They're spending a lot more time on connected TV, watching even on smartphones rather than traditional TV. And where they go for their content for news is sort of this blending, if you will, of entertainment and politics.
For example, Brabender says many young voters are more likely to watch a show like Saturday Night Live than the nightly news.
Do you think I care about optics? Look at me. I sit on every chair like it's a toilet, okay?
That's a space Republicans have almost no presence.
There's got to be some changes or we're going to lose an entire generation of voters for all practical purposes.
And more than that, he says messaging is critical.
Even tone and tenor matters a lot. We have a tendency to want to sell and preach and lecture, whereas, you know, this audience cares more about education and learning and coming to their own conclusions. So how you reach them and what that content looks like, and it certainly has to have an entertainment value too, because you do want them to share within their internal communities. And we just haven't done a good enough job at that or put enough emphasis on it, and we have to start doing that.
And on actual issues.
We've ignored everything from climate change to student loans to other issues that we haven't seen important enough, but they do, and so we have to start talking there.
And it's not just millennials. Brabender says the next generation, Generation Z, could also create a number of challenges for the GOP. He says there's no more waiting out the storm. In Washington, Jenna Browder, CBN News.
Thanks, Jenna. The Federal Aviation Administration does not plan to ground Boeing 737 MAX aircraft for now. The FAA issuing a continued airworthiness notification Monday, even as at least 5 nations and 25 airlines have temporarily suspended flights amid the ongoing investigation into Sunday's crash in Ethiopia. It's the second deadly crash involving the airliner in 4 months. However, U.S. carriers Southwest and American are still using the 737 MAX. The FAA is assisting in the investigation and says if it identifies any issues that affect safety, it will take immediate and appropriate action. Well, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says all remaining American staff at the U.S. Embassy in Venezuela will be leaving the country by the end of the week. This as the political crisis continues to rock the country. The United States supports opposition leader Juan Guaido and the country's legislature in an ongoing battle to oust President Nicolas Maduro, claiming Maduro stole the most recent elections. Pat?
Well, you know, the thing we've got to recognize about Venezuela is the Cubans are running the show. Cuban troops are in there supporting Maduro. Cuban troops are dictating what's going to happen, and they aren't subject to the various pressures. They want to continue that country as a satellite. They've sucked up a tremendous amount of the Venezuelan oil. They have been getting subsidies from Venezuela, and now they don't want to give it up. So again, the normal channels of pressure are not working. And as I've said before, and I'll say it again, sooner or later, it's got to be military. Those Cubans are not going to be persuaded to leave Venezuela just because they're nice guys. We've got to do something, and it's going to take action and overwhelming action. And, you know, the whole concept that we used a long time ago in Iraq, the shock and awe, if you put enough troops in and enough firepower, those Cubans will melt away, and the Venezuelan army that's supporting Maduro will desert him, and he'll go down. But that's a humanitarian crisis. We're talking about disease, we're talking about poverty, we're talking about tragedy, we're talking about insustainable out-migration, and not to mention what's happening in Colombia has got to feed all those Venezuelans that are coming across the border, and they need help, and the Colombian people are giving aid to them, and it costs them a lot of money. So it's time for the nations of Latin America to get together. And we ought to be standing beside to help them, certainly to arm them, to give them what they need. But the time for talk, in my opinion, is over. Well, we've got a report now that Senator Lindsey Graham has got a good proposal out. He's head of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and we have John with that.
That's right, Pat. South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham says he will push for the United States to recognize the Golan Heights as part of Israel. Graham and U.S. Ambassador to Israel David Friedman visited the Golan with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu Monday. Graham said he believes there's bipartisan support in Congress for recognizing the strategic plateau as part of Israel.
In the State Department, there's a map, and this part, the Golan, is labeled as disputed territory. My goal is to try to persuade the administration to change that designation. That is not disputed. The Golan is not in dispute. The Golan is in the hands of Israel and always remain in the hands of Israel.
I agree.
The Golan Heights came back into Israel's hands as a result of the 1967 Six-Day War. Since the outbreak of the Syrian civil war, it has become increasingly more volatile. The presence of Iran now inside Syria, Pat, with the presence of Iran now inside Syria, it is even more critical to Israel.
Well, you know, I've been at the Golan. I was up there with General Benny Gantz, who's the chief of, or at least he's the retiring chief of staff of the IDF, and we went all over the northern Israel, and you can look down into a place called Quneitra, and from the Golan, you can pretty much see all the way down to Damascus. But that was a key strategic place, and the fighting to gain back the Golan was one of the most intense tank battles in the history of warfare. And I think Israel is not about to give it up. And so it's time that the nations recognize that this is an integral part of Israel, and it was captured after a bitter battle, And the only thing that would happen is giving it back to Syria, and Syria is now in chaos. So Lindsey Graham was right on the money, and once again, the relationship between President Trump and Bibi Netanyahu is very, very strong, and we're delighted. Now, we're going to talk about an author who's been called a modern-day Nostradamus.
That's right. Coming up, author Joel Rosenberg talks about his latest thriller, ripped from tomorrow's headlines. What happens if Russia, Iran, and North Korea get into a nuclear gamble? Hear the facts behind the fiction when we come back.